Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Thank you for your patience. Welcome to AAMO's 21st Triennial Conference. We will begin the day's proceedings with the welcome and theme address by AAMO President, Mr. Rajiv Kaul. It is my privilege to introduce Mr. Kaul to you all today. Mr. Rajiv Kaul is the chairman of Nico Engineering Services Limited and founder promoter of Nico Parks and Resorts Limited. He is a former honorary consul general of the Republic of Korea, a position he held for over 20 years. He has held leadership positions in several industry bodies and also served on the boards of some of India's leading educational institutes. Mr. Kaul is actively involved in his philanthropic endeavors and is associated with some of India's leading charitable trusts. With these words, may I kindly request Mr. Kaul to commence his address.
Thank you, Smita. Thank you for your warm words of introduction. And good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And some of you are already in the afternoon, so a good afternoon to all of you as well, those who are outside the morning zone. On behalf of the Asian Association of Management Organizations, AAMO, it is with great pleasure that I welcome all of you to AAMO's 21st Triennial Conference. We are all delighted to have you with us today, and thank you for joining us for this special conference, albeit virtually. Established almost 60 years ago, AAMO is an independent, non-political, not-for-profit partnership of various countries and national management organizations within Asia and indeed Asia Pacific region. Currently, we have 10 members, which include Australia, Hong Kong, India, Macau, Malaysia, Nepal, New Zealand, Pakistan, Philippines, and Sri Lanka. India, through the All India Management Association, took over the presidency and the secretariat of AAMO in 2019 for a tenure of 3 years, which will culminate today at the end of our conference. As per tradition, the completion of each presidential term is marked by AAMO's flagship event, the Triennial Conference. And as the present holder of AAMO's presidency, it is AIMA's privilege to host this conference. As AAMO President, it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to this important exchange among Asia's national management organizations. It has been a great privilege leading AAMO through the past 3 years, although this period was blighted by COVID. I am satisfied with what we have been managed to do under these trying circumstances by leveraging digital technologies. Before the COVID lockdowns were clamped on us, we were able to hold the AAMO Leadership Awards in physical modes in Kathmandu and Nepal this year, and previously in Malaysia, in Kuala Lumpur. And these Asian Leadership Awards were presented last time by the Prime Minister of Nepal and the previous time by the Prime Minister of Malaysia. Unfortunately, we could not have this at this event. While AAMO's Young Managers Program, a special program for budding professionals involving on-site visits and interactions, would hold only one edition pre-COVID, I am happy to report that the hugely popular Asian Management Games was successfully migrated to an online mode and was held annually with participating teams nominated by our member organizations. Another key initiative of AAMO, the Management Capability Development Index report, was successfully rolled out and published by the Macau Management Association and AIMA in 2020 and 2022, respectively. The MCDI was first conceived by the erstwhile New Zealand Institute of Management, and the survey is used to measure and evaluate management capability across industries and sectors. Both the reports received an excellent response from their respective locations. AIMA has strived to carry forward AAMO's mission of sharing knowledge and resources among national management organizations. It has held meets to allow peer review and transmission of strategies and expertise to deal with the issues created both by the health and economic crisis. Despite the severe constraints on travel and in-person interaction, we have ensured that the management leaders of Asia remain engaged with each other and develop new ideas for thriving in a post-crisis world. Of course, camaraderie has been a bit of a lapse in this period. The constraint imposed by lockdowns and healthcare has, in a way, proved a blessing in disguise, because technology has really taken AAMO forward, and we have been able to rapidly digitize most of our activities and platforms. AAMO members have evolved into a digitally connected organization and fraternity, and have managed to ensure continuity of our activity through use of digital technology. Regional cooperation is the theme of this conference, and the world is changing and Asia is changing. Thus, the Asia's so-called emerging economies are becoming now the new anchors of the global economy and are today its primary growth drivers. Asia is now the home to 3 of the world's 5 largest economies, and if we treat ASEAN as a single economy, Asia is home to 4 of the 7 largest economies of our world. Asia has always been the most populated continent, and it was also the most prosperous continent until the Industrial Revolution. As Asia industrializes and digitizes and grows aggressively in the 4th economic generation, its workforce and consumption shall allow it to keep growing for decades to come, while a saturated West would rely on Asia to sustain growth of its economies. Asian countries need to develop a regional and global vision and appreciate that their individual prosperity and power depends on others' cooperation and support within our region. It is thus critical that Asian neighbors do not fritter away our potential by shifting our focus from the big picture of the global and regional prosperity to a narrow nationalistic agenda. The several crises of the past 2 decades have shown that nothing can be taken for granted, and there could be new challenges around the corner. Today, the world has become extremely connected and therefore all the good as also bad gets transmitted fairly rapidly, both regionally and globally. Each country is affected by what happens in others, whether it is open or closed to outsiders, and whether it coordinates its policies with others or not, whether it behaves according to global rules or not. Today, more than ever, everyone has learned the value of cooperation and coordination, first due to the COVID shock, and now the monetary and policy inflation shock. In a world with extreme uncertainty, the only way to achieve some level of stability is by sharing priorities and working together on both opportunities as also challenges. At the moment, Asian countries are reeling under the high impact of inflation and monetary policy swings of both US and Europe. While inflation is slowing down economic growth in Asia, the runaway dollar, due to the sharp interest rate hikes in the US, is trampling all over Asian currencies, adding to rising import costs and accentuating fiscal pressures, as also enlarging the debt of our nations. Supply chain reliability and predictability have become a global issue ever since the outbreak of COVID. Slowly but surely, global companies are de-risking their sourcing and spreading suppliers to different parts of Asia. However, the alternative supply bases cannot be entirely isolated from each other. There has to be significant level of integration even in the redistributed supply chains for seamless production to continue in countries, regions, and indeed the world. For the new Asian supply chains to work, all countries across the supply footprint have to enable easy, quick, and scalable movement of goods, people, and capital. They need to cooperate with each other to gain from the supply chain reorganization, even as they compete for a greater share of the supply pie. The rapid digitization of the economy is another key area for cooperation among our Asian countries. While much of the production of digital goods is concentrated in and around Asia, the greater value in future will come from a widely delivered digital services. Data, as the cliche goes, is the new oil, and Asian countries need to work out ways to own data, facilitate trade in data-enabled services. In the digitized economy, every person and product must produce and transmit data, often across borders. While national governments are scrambling to control data of their newly digitized subjects, they also need to reach agreements with other national governments on terms of storage and use of data emanating from other countries. There is also a need to coordinate and cooperate in the area of digital infrastructure, standards, and laws to allow networks to function smoothly and lawfully. Asia has a special responsibility when it comes to containing climate change. Being the factory of the world, Asia has to produce responsibly. The region must lead the development and indeed adoption of green technologies, processes, and products. Asia has the largest number of young people in the world, and Asia's leaders owe a future to our next generation. There are immense opportunities for cooperation in alternative energies and green technologies among our Asian counterparts. Energy technologies are the key to sustainable economic growth, and Asia must and shall take lead in developing and adopting low carbon energy sources and applications. The 21st century is the Asian century, and there are tremendous opportunities for our region to set the global economic and geopolitical agenda. However, Asia's centrality is contingent on its countries and sub-regions cooperating with each other rather than trying to dominate each other. Asia's transition is in full swing. It has everything going for it, provided its leaders provide a larger and accommodative vision. This conference is an ideal platform for decision makers and management practitioners of the Asia-Pacific region to take stock of opportunities and challenges and better prepare themselves to thrive together in today's rapidly changing environment. I shall be stepping down as the president of AIMA by the end of the day, and I am confident that under our next president, AIMA shall continue to create platforms for the management community to meet, discuss, and chart out the way forward. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank everybody at AIMO and AIMA for helping me perform my duties as its president. I will always be available to AIMO and my successors for any input or guidance, and I will wholeheartedly support the next president in taking AIMO forward. It has been a pleasure and privilege for me to serve as the AIMO president for the last 3 years. With these words, may I once again welcome all of you to the 21st Triennial Conference of AIMO, and I am sure that we shall all gain deep insights and perspectives for the eminent speakers who follow. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kaul, for kicking off the Triennial Conference with your welcome address. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now move on to the first session of the day, which is a panel discussion on the Asian imperative, regionalism in a broken world. Please remember, you can always post your questions to the panelists using the Q&A link on the portal. It is my privilege to welcome on the digital dais our speakers for the session, Professor Samuel Tong Kai Chung, Professor Jomo Kwame Sundaram, Professor Mark Michelson, and our moderator, Mr. T.K. Arun. Before we begin, it is my privilege to give you a brief introduction of all our panelists today. Professor Samuel Tong Kai Chung is the president of the Macau Institute of Management and a member of Talent Development Committee, Higher Education Committee, and Tourism Development Committee of Macau SAR government. He was a researcher at the Tourism Research Center of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. He has also held management positions in Fortune Global 500 companies and listed group companies in Taiwan and Hong Kong. Professor Jomo Kwame Sundaram is a senior advisor, Khazana Research Institute, Fellow Academy of Science Malaysia, Emeritus Professor, University of Malaya, and Fellow Initiative for Policy Dialogue, Columbia University. He was UN Assistant Secretary General for Economic Development, Assistant Director General, Food and Agriculture Organization, Founder Chair, International Development Economics Associates, and President, Malaysian Social Science Association. Professor Mark Michelson is an adjunct associate professor for master's programs in global political economy and in public policy at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. He is also the chairman of the Asia CEO Forum for AIMA Asia. He has served as chairman of the American Chamber of Commerce in Hong Kong and the Hong Kong Country Club, and has been a member of 3 Hong Kong government advisory committees. And our moderator for the session, Mr. T.K. Arun. He is one of India's leading journalists and writes extensively on a range of subjects overlapping with political economy. A former resident editor of the Economic Times, he headed the Economic Bureau and looked after the editorial page of the paper. He has also worked as a technical advisor at the Kerala State Planning Board. It's now my privilege to request Mr. T.K. Arun to kindly take the session forward.
Thank you, Smita. Professor Michelson, Professor Tong, Professor Sundaram. You are all people experienced of the world of business and geopolitics. Nobody can but be experienced after living through the times we have been living through. Now, we are supposed to discuss the concept of regional cooperation in Asia in a fracturing world. Now, I would like, first of all, to ask you, is regional cooperation on a continent-wide basis really possible when the world is fracturing on geopolitical lines in which members of Asia will find themselves aligned on one side and some other members on another side? So are we talking about regional cooperation across this geopolitical divides, or are we talking of regional cooperation within each side of the geopolitical divide? Or is there a way of bridging this geopolitical divide that we see before us? May I request Professor Tong to kick off?
So thank you, Mr. Aaron, and thank you to the Asian Association of Management Organization for the invitation to speak at this plenary sections. Yes, globalization or regionalization is always a hot topic in the media. Cooperation and trade have played an important role in supporting economic development and promoting peaceful relations among nations and preventing conflict. Cooperation among the 27 member states of the EU is one of the role models. Globalization seems to be waning in the post-pandemic era, and the world decoupled attracts everyone's attention. Competition between the world's biggest economy and the second one seems to push other economies into difficult moments, especially those that are small scale and heavily depending on international trade and foreign direct investment. So it's hard to make a choice between the biggest and the second biggest markets. RTA in the WTO may be one of those solutions. I mean, regional trade agreements. We can see the very good example in Singapore. Singapore is a successful example of how the city-state can enjoy continuous growth over the years while RTA. It can provide a stable and foreseeable business environment and increase the scale of the market. Currently, Singapore has 27 RTAs in force. The US-Singapore RTA became effective in January 2004. The China-Singapore RTA became effective in January 2009. And the EU-Singapore RTA became effective in November 2019. There are two more RTAs for which an early announcement has been made. And one of them is the Ukraine-Singapore RTA. And last year, the real GDP growth rate of Singapore was 7.6%. Last but not least, the fact is that no single economy in the modern world, no matter how big it is, can produce everything efficiently by itself alone. So that's why we need a division of labor and exchange or trade and to cooperate with other economies in the world. Thank you.
Professor Sundaram?
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Arun. My own view is perhaps rather pessimistic. My own impression is that Asia has not really ever seen itself as a unit. It is a unit defined by geography and not even by colonialism or any other phenomena. So we see that despite the late Jawaharlal Nehru's attempt to organize the Asian Relations Conference in 1947, there has never really been a single effort to try to unite on a continental basis. Nonetheless, I do think that there's much to be said for sub-regionalism within the Asia-Pacific context. And as far as sub-regionalism is concerned, I think we know very well that ASEAN has been a reasonable regional cooperation arrangement, and there have been other efforts to do so as well. Most significantly, I would emphasize the recent RCEP, the Regional Cooperation for Economic Partnership, as well as the earlier effort to have what is often referred to as the Chiang Mai Agreement. But the very fact that we do not have a larger forum for discussion within Asia limits the likelihood that Asia as a unit would ever be significant. It's very difficult to try to organize and put together such cooperation, especially in rush circumstances, as we well know. Having said that, I do think it is all the more important that most of Asia thinks very seriously about cooperation, at least in the sense of committing to non-alignment. And this commitment to non-alignment has to be beyond Asia. It involves Africa and Latin America, and perhaps even some European countries. Now, the comparison, of course, is with the non-aligned movement, which began in 1961 in Belgrade. But I think we are talking about a non-alignment of a different type, given the circumstances which we face in the world today. It is not a challenge between, say, capitalism versus communism or anything like that. We are living in a world with varieties of capitalism, and it is important to recognize that the conflicts, the so-called new Cold War, for instance, is a Cold War which has been determined by circumstances which are quite different from the original Cold War. And so the contemporary non-alignment has to address the challenges of the current circumstances rather than simply see itself as a continuation of the previous non-alignment. What this means needs to be elaborated among the major parties concerned, but certainly I think most of Asia would not want to be caught in the new Cold War, would not want to take sides in the new Cold War, and rather it stands to benefit from some kind of more equitable globalization than the globalization which we have seen over recent decades. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Michelson.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to AAMO for organizing this and introducing, putting us all together. I agree. I mean, I think the challenges were outlined in the opening address by Mr. Paul, talking about the challenges of globalization, but the importance of engagement, the challenges of cooperation and globalization, but the importance of cooperation and engaging with each other. And I think Asia, despite the challenges that were just well outlined, is probably best placed to do this in many ways. Asia has been arguably the biggest beneficiary of globalization, and our economies continue to demonstrate high level of support for trade liberalization and strong international division of labor, which is not always shared by the rest of the world, which makes it, of course, a lot more challenging. There are several areas in which cooperation, I think, has a chance to be achieved and should be achieved, although it will be difficult. They were mentioned by Mr. Call in many cases. Climate change is clearly one of them. He didn't mention vaccine and healthcare, but clearly that's another area. And so is digitalization. And digitalization is clearly one of the biggest challenges, but also one of the biggest opportunities for all of us now. We need to bring the rest of the world online and help bring them online and lead perhaps international efforts on data standards, on cybersecurity, on artificial intelligence, many other areas. Clearly very important to our progress going forward, but clearly involves a number of issues. But Asian economies, many of them, are somewhat best placed to do that. Just think of the progress that's been made in places like China, like in India, even in Indonesia, in the rest of Southeast Asia. It's really important, I think, for us to take this challenge and move forward. But as was just outlined, it's going to be very difficult to do so in a situation where there's greater polarization, especially, I think, in North America and Europe at the moment. But maybe we can set the example, and we can set some examples. And I agree that RCEP, the new agreement which involves almost all of Asia Pacific. I know not India yet, but maybe at some point, but all of Asia Pacific. It's not what's the content now, but the opportunity that kind of agreement presents, and maybe it's a platform for moving forward. I remain hopefully optimistic, but I also recognize the challenges that we all face. And I think we all have to work very hard and try to work very hard together to try to overcome them.
Yeah. And now, may I submit that there are 2-3 reasons which did not obtain in the latter half of the 20th century, which compel cooperation across divides of geopolitics and other kinds of regional alignments. One is aging in the rich world. This causes them to save a lot. So the total amount of investable savings in the world are more plentiful than ever before in the past. And the need for profitable deployment of these savings. Now, these have to be deployed, not necessarily in those places where savers accumulated these corpus. It has to be deployed where growth is the fastest, which means, generally speaking, generation of savings, deployable savings in the rich world, in the Western world, and the deployment in Asia. This compulsion did not exist in the past. The second is, of course, climate change. Climate change, again, requires the entire world to cooperate on a number of issues. Now, I would submit that this current focus on emission reduction is actually myopic, that the only way that we can prevent the world from heating up to 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial levels is for the rich world to bite the bullet and remove carbon dioxide from the air, direct capture of carbon dioxide from the air and its disposal either underground or as a feedstock for creating new products. If that is done on a large enough scale, creating net emissions now rather than net zero by 2050, we have some chance of containing or reversing climate change. Now, this again is something which requires the entire world to cooperate. What do you think is the scope for these challenges of profitable deployment of savings in the Asian region and Africa, as well as of fighting climate change, or in compelling some kind of cooperation across the traditional divides that actually cut across Asia also? Was there Tom?
I can say that at this moment it's very difficult to predict that which region will recover faster than the others, because you mentioned that Asian will be one of the a good place for investment, but you know that we are facing the difficult time that we are called stagflation. At the one hand, we are facing the inflation, and at the same time, we are facing the recession. So that's why it's very difficult to find the solutions at this moment. Yes, but I think that the most important is that we need to work together. So that's why I think that it's not a zero-sum game. That means that globalization and regionalization is not a zero-sum game. You need to, or maybe you can cooperate with your partner in the region, not mainly or focusing on the same geographic area. At that time, and then you need to work together with all the partners in the world. This is my point. Thank you.
Professor Sundaram?
Yes, thank you, Arun. My own impression is that while those issues you highlighted remain very pressing, and there obviously is a need for international cooperation, it's not clear to me that that Asia is necessarily the best way to mobilize international cooperation around this. As I emphasized earlier, there aren't existing pan-Asian organizations. I just returned last night from Dakar in Senegal, and there's a very palpable, strong sense of affinity in terms of Pan-Africanism and the need for Pan-African cooperation. Previously, I've experienced the same thing in Latin America, at least, but there's no such sense in Asia. Nonetheless, we need to address those issues and many more, in fact. And it's precisely for that reason that we need to have forums of dialogue going not only at the Asian level, but also beyond as far as necessary. I think India, for example, provided very important leadership during the pandemic by putting forward the waiver resolution to waive the intellectual property rights for pandemic-related needs during the duration of the pandemic. Unfortunately, this was rejected by the West, rejected particularly by Europe, and also at the WTO, where you need a consensus. So we have seen the difficulties of cooperation at that level. But nonetheless, other types of arrangements, perhaps bypassing those who refuse to cooperate, should be made. It is important, for example, to recognize that a great deal of photovoltaic solar panels are actually manufactured in places like China and Korea and Malaysia, and that should be extended all over the world, not just to Asia. Likewise, I would say the same thing for some of the other issues which you highlighted. But we have to be wary about some of the aspects of globalization. While trade liberalization may be desirable, it's not very clear that in all circumstances it's desirable. As we have seen, for example, in Africa, trade liberalization meant deindustrialization. It also meant food insecurity, greater food insecurity, with very, very consequential implications, as we have seen with the famines which are looming now large right now. Now, what do we do about, say, questions of food insecurity? India, because of the last harvest, has stopped exporting wheat, and understandably so. But what do we do in these circumstances where there are unilateral sanctions being imposed by certain parties against other parties? And so the disruptions which began with the pandemic, the trade disruptions, the supply side disruptions which began with the pandemic, have been extended by war as well as by sanctions. This is hardly conducive to a more benign globalization. On other fronts, we have seen financial globalization having very devastating consequences in different parts of the world. We have seen, for example, more and more countries going into very serious debt crisis right now. We all know in this part of the world about what has happened in Sri Lanka, but it's not just Sri Lanka which is facing such problems. So we need to begin to work out those mechanisms. We need, for example, I would very much favor an Asian regional monetary fund to help out. What we have in East Asia is actually not too bad. It could be much better in terms of the so-called Chiang Mai Agreement and Chiang Mai Plus and so on. But many other mechanisms are very much needed, especially by developing countries in Asia. And unfortunately, there are no existing forums which would advance that. And so we need to really think about this. But I'm not sure that calling for such arrangements on an Asian basis makes much sense when you do not even have strong proponents of Asian cooperation, beyond the occasional individuals calling for such Asian cooperation. We need to begin with existing institutions, and we need to extend those institutions beyond. We need to recognize the realities which we face in the world today, and the likelihood of continued global international tensions, politely referred to as geopolitical tensions, which are likely to pose a lot of challenges for Asian countries. Thank you.
Professor Michelson?
Thank you. I'm a little more hopeful, although I recognize the problems. I think in terms of climate change, I think Asia, and particularly places like China, are well placed, because China, especially leadership, views it as an existential issue, which it is, and really affects everything else we've been talking about, because we can't move very, very far or fast on any of the issues we've been talking about without dealing with this one, because it will overwhelm us otherwise. And I think although COVID set us back, including China, maybe back toward more dependence on fossil fuels and other areas, there's an opportunity there. We also have some institutions. Maybe the traditional institutions aren't as strong and have been weakening. In fact, I teach a course called From Bretton Woods to G20, and I'm not sure if any of that is relevant anymore, including the institutions associated with that. They've obviously been weakened over the years and that's been accelerated by what's happened over the last 3 years or so. But at the same time, we have an institution like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIB, which is not perfect. It's small, but what it's done, in contrast to what's happened to places like Sri Lanka and other places, when it's directed loans and support, especially in the areas of infrastructure, they've been well investigated. It's been applied generally successfully. It at least sets a pattern, and that is, although there are members from all over the world, it is an Asia-focused institution that may at least give us some hope for the future going forward. But we need to do a lot more. And as just been outlined, the challenges we face are greater, and geopolitical conflicts, especially between the US and China, but other places as well, are not going to get better quickly. And so we're going to have to find new ways of cooperation, and maybe that will start within the region with of course cooperating and working with others who are willing to work with us on various issues.
Yeah, with the Conference of Parties to the UN Climate Convention due to meet very soon, we will see whether the leaders of the world, including those at either end of the geopolitical distribution, are willing to come together to tackle some of these issues. Now, these issues cannot be tackled without cooperation, and that is something that is staring us in the face. Whether we encounter prolonged droughts, sudden floods, landslides, forest fires, and other freaks of nature which are killing us and harming us across the world by large numbers, there is no way but for the world to cooperate. And this is something that the people can see and their leaders can see. I'm sure that this will actually compel some kind of cooperation in the near future. And I don't see countries being able to shirk their responsibility on the climate front. The US, which had never till now taken any formal stand on this, has finally, through the Inflation Reduction Act, begun to take some legislative action on this front. I remain hopeful. Now, let me take another issue, which is actually forcing cooperation. And this is actually innovations in finance. Yesterday, India launched its digital currency, the digital rupee, on the blockchain. Right now, only for use in wholesale red markets. Hopefully, they will soon extend it to retail use as well. China's digital yuan has been going strong for quite some time. In 2021, with the help of the Bank for International Settlements Innovation Hub in Hong Kong, an international transaction was made involving the UAE, China, and Thailand to settle payments using the digital yuan. Now, these are implications that go far beyond mere curiosity value in terms of innovation. For example, if you can have ways of settling international transactions that do not involve a US counterparty in a currency other than the dollar, it will have significant changes in the way world power is now configured to give the US the opportunity to weaponize the dollar, because that is the predominant currency of the world. Dollar sanctions can actually cripple an economy. Cutting off any country or an entity within a country from the dollar network of New York can actually be devastating. However, if you have a means of settling international transactions, international payments through digital means using the new technology, the blockchain, that will actually alter things substantially. What do you think? Professor Tom?
As we mentioned before, that globalization, regionalization, and nationalism interact to shape the world of political economy. So you mentioned that sometimes we use the economic tools to meet the goal of political situations. I think that so we need to prevent to this. We need to cooperate with each other, and then we know that some of the especially in the financial or digital world, it's very difficult to isolate each other. We need to cooperate, and we need to provide safe and security environment for the transaction in the world. So that's why come back to the theme of this section is that we need to cooperate to each other and to establish an institution and to keep our digital world, including financial transaction in the between the border, safety and security, and to meet the goal of the economics and the development for all the countries, and it's not the political reason or only to use the economic measures to put on the other area. Thank you.
Professor Sundaram?
Yes, thank you very much, Arun. I think that's a very interesting question which has been raised. What is happening right now in the world, it seems to me, is a very curious phenomenon of the United States and its allies deliberately excluding more and more countries from international transactions by keeping them out of the international payment system which already exists and which are currently dominated by Wall Street. This basically is forcing not only its antagonists, but also others to resort to other payment systems. And so the digital rupee basically joins a number of other currencies which are all seeking to have different modes of transactions. It's a brave new world which we are entering, and it's unclear what the likely consequences are. But I think it is important for us to recognize that this will possibly result in a system which perhaps hasn't existed since before the Second World War. 51 years ago, as the older one here, I'm probably the older one judging by the color of my hair, will remember that President Nixon withdrew the US from the Bretton Woods system. And what followed then was a period of international monetary uncertainty. And more countries, especially those which were constrained in terms of foreign exchange earnings, resorted to other arrangements, resorted to what was sometimes referred to, perhaps wrongly, as barter arrangements and so on. Now that is coming to an end precisely because of the politics of the current moment. And with that, we are likely to see countries trying to create new payment systems. It's unclear at this point what these new payment systems are going to look like, but it's probably going to be the case that eventually these national requirements will come together to form some kind of an alternative international payment systems, which is probably going to be suboptimal from a point of view of global economic welfare, but which will probably be necessitated and is likely to continue for some time to come. And so we are going to have basically two-currency world system in the future. It's unclear what the alternative currency will be. China is, of course, the largest economy which has been antagonized by the US. And it's possible that it might be some kind of renminbi plus system, but the other arrangements may well emerge. But in any case, I think this is likely to happen. It's not necessarily optimum, but there is very little likelihood of any possible return at the international level for some time to come of developing an international payment system comparable to what, for example, John Maynard Keynes conceived of in 1944. So short of that, I expect there to be some degree of cooperation. And it is very likely that many countries who are not caught up in, who are not protagonists in the new Cold War will resort to a bifurcated payment system for the international transactions. Now, what this will mean as the world may continue to have more greater international economic relations is still unclear. But again, the absence of, say, an Asian monetary fund or any kind of arrangement comparable to that will not make Asia as a whole necessarily a significant party in this regard.
Professor Michelson?
Well, I think Asia could be the driving force in this change. In my class, and I talk about Bretton Woods, and you could arguably in 1944 we needed a reserve currency, and it was the U.S. dollar at that time, and it functioned that way pretty successfully for about 15 years or so, and then we came to a situation where it wasn't, partly stimulated by what the U.S. was doing in terms of how it was spending its money and the war in Vietnam and other complications. But since then, the world's been sort of searching for Bretton Woods too. I'm not sure if we're ever going to get that, or even we want to get it, but certainly for an alternative to having one reserve currency, the US dollar. And my students always call for that, many of the mainlanders, and you can understand why. And this digital currency might be one of those possibilities, one of those options for moving forward. And I think Asia is probably further ahead than many other places in doing this. This might not be an Asian-wide initiative, at least not yet, but nonetheless, I think certain governments, certain economies in Asia might take the lead. And I'm not convinced that others that are maybe outside the U.S. may want to join this, even if they have opinions sort of the opposite on other geopolitical issues. In other words, maybe they're opposing maybe some views on other geopolitical issues, but might see this as a way of cooperation. At least we can hope so. But I think it's an aspiration of many countries around the world, including some Western countries, as well, of course, as developing countries and those in Asia, Africa, and elsewhere.
Yeah. I would just try to look at this theme that Professor Sundaram raised about the need for a specifically Asian institution for this kind of cooperation to take place. Now, the 2021 experiment in settling cross-border payments involving the United Arab Emirates, Asian country, China, Asian country, and Thailand was initiated and transacted through the Innovation Hub or the Bank for International Settlement, which is based in Zurich and which is a global body. Now, their Innovation Hub happened to be in Hong Kong, Asia, but it is not necessarily an Asian institution. So this points to the possibility of existing international institutions and frameworks being allowed to function in a fashion that allows, even regional cooperation, regional transactions, non-traditional transactions on a global scale. Now, the G20 agreed to a common framework because the Paris Club does not include China, which is one of the largest lenders in the world today. Now, the IMF doesn't allow China, India, and some other countries their proportionate weightage in their voting. Now, the question is, the Paris Club obviously doesn't include China. If the emerging or the existing reality of much larger Asian economies being salient in various ways, relevant in various ways, being allowed to be reflected in institutional arrangements, wouldn't that actually suffice to function as a global framework instead of creating new frameworks necessarily restricted to Asia. Was it all?
So, we all know that the existing international institution framework, like the World Bank, WTO, or the GATE before, or IMF, is established since 1944, as you mentioned, that the Bretton Woods Agreement, which was led by the Western countries or economies. So if we can use the current institution to provide or can provide deliver these public goods, international public goods, to solve the problem, I think that is the best choice or the best solutions to solve some of the conflict or some of the problem existing in the world, like the climate change or the other conflicts. So I better say that if China, or if the second biggest markets in the world can integrate in the existing institution, I think that is the best solution to solve most of the problem, and it's the most efficient rate. Thank you.
Professor Sundaram?
Yes, thank you very much. I quite agree with the sentiment behind your question. It's not clear to me that the existing arrangements will necessarily accommodate themselves to the needs. And I also think it's important for us to recognize that we are living in very uncertain times. The future, I mean, who would have expected the developments of the last year, for example, to have happened? And so I think it's very difficult to expect an adequate multilateral arrangement to emerge within this context. At the Asian level, as I've emphasized perhaps ad nauseum, we have a situation where we do not have any pre-existing conditions for such a thing. Now, there is a tendency in East Asia to talk about East Asia as if it is all of Asia. And we know how, as a consequence of that, it became very difficult, for example, to work with South Asia and particularly with India with the RCEP arrangements, because Indian concerns are quite different from many of the concerns in East Asia. So we need to have a lot of greater understanding within the region, even between East Asia and South Asia, before we're going to make any progress, let alone West Asia, Central Asia, and so on and so forth. So I think there's a lot to be done before we move beyond that. And one of the big problems is that doing many of the arrangements around involving China have now become suspect as far as the West is concerned. China is now virtually the second enemy to Russia. And of course, many people in the West have admitted that the real target is actually China. It's not Russia. Russia is not considered to be a major economic threat as far as the West is concerned. So we have very, very difficult times, and this is part of the reason why for those of us who are not embroiled in the current Cold War, or at least as it is currently aligned, it is important for us not to be aligned and to be able to try to explore the possibilities of finding solutions. It should be a proactive neutrality as we try to go forward in these very challenging times. Thank you.
Professor Michelson?
Yeah, I was about to raise the point of cooperation within Asia as well, because I think that's one of the challenges that we face. But at the same time, it may not be multilateral exactly. It might be plurilateral, which is what we're seeing more and more in these cases. But I think we have examples where a lot of countries, including those from the West, have found ways of working within some organizations that include China and others. And I hope that can serve as an example for moving forward, because I think without that, without finding some means of cooperation, that's the theme of this discussion anyway, we're going to be in real trouble, because all these issues that you've put on the table and many more beyond that really require us to find ways to work together. And I think Asia is well placed, especially certain Asian economies. Many Asian economies are well placed to take the lead in this, despite the challenges and the obstacles that we definitely will face. But I think the consequences of not doing that are much greater.
Yeah, may I submit that while competition is inevitable, there is also the scope to cooperate even while competing. You look at the satellites that are used for global positioning, letting you know your coordinates, where you stand, where you fly, where you are sailing on the seas. The Americans have the GPS. The Russians have the GLONASS. The Chinese have their own satellite system. The Europeans, who are very close allies of the US, have developed Galileo, because they don't want to be reliant completely on the US satellite navigation at a time when the US might not be too well disposed towards them. And India has its own NAVIC global positioning system. So while cooperating, in the case between Europe and US at the closest level, you find that countries are actually making sure that they have the insurance of being able to rely on their own resources, right? So this, I would think, could be one model. Now, if you look at the way the geopolitics of technology are evolving, now the US has actually forbidden some kind of technological exports to China. Advanced technology that allow the Chinese to acquire self-reliance in the most advanced microchips has been barred. And this will affect some US companies in terms of their commercial opportunities, but the US is willing to tolerate that kind of a loss. At the same time, artificial intelligence, the advances in quantum communications and quantum cryptography, this, to my mind, will force the world to cooperate. Today, the encryption that is the basis for security of all our digital life, the dematerialized accounts that hold the wealth of nations, the banking infrastructure, all these are dependent upon cryptography of the conventional kind. Advances in quantum computing can undo this cryptographic security in a matter of hours. Now, unless countries cooperate in containing the destructive potential of advances in quantum cryptography, you will find the world facing chaos. Now, just as America and Russia or the USSR were forced to undertake START, or strategic arms reduction and limitation and anti-ballistic missile kind of agreements, when they were perfectly hostile, they were forced to cooperate, given the reality of the potential for damage on both sides. Isn't that a similar situation here, which will compel countries to cooperate on many counts which are vital for survival and prosperity in the world? Professor Tong.
I think that we have no choice because most of the or some of the difficulties that we are facing cannot solved by one country or one economies. The theme of today's topic is discussing is about segmentation, globalization, or regionalization, or geopolitical. I think that the most driven is by the country's interest. So that's why when some economies, no matter how big you are, if you cannot solve the problem by yourself, after the cost and benefit analysis, and if you are reasonable, so you need to find some solutions. One of the solutions is that you need to cooperate with each other. So that means that this is the only solutions for us, for all the countries in this world to cooperate with each other. Otherwise, we cannot solve most of the problem, solve most of the conflicts. Thank you.
Sundaram?
Yes, thank you. I'm not sure how much time we have because our colleagues are waiting to take the floor. But let me just emphasize that technology, unfortunately, is going to be the main area of contestation, and we see the breakdown of past mechanisms of technology cooperation. This has been made possible by the TRIPS arrangement of the World Trade Organization, which has basically strengthened intellectual property rights. And we have seen some so-called free trade agreements recently, further strengthening such monopolies. And now we see a political interference to protect monopolies and to undermine monopolies which are seen to be held by others. Who might be potentially antagonistic. This is a very, very dangerous situation. We are unlikely to see a situation comparable to the situation, for example, in the late 1970s and 80s, where when the Soviet Union challenged President Carter to eliminate smallpox, within a decade, smallpox was eliminated precisely because of that kind of US-Soviet cooperation. But that's the exception rather than the rule as far as technology competition is concerned. And technology competition is now being mobilized in the West with what is called mission capitalism to promote and accentuate the technological edge which the West has had historically over developing countries. And this, unfortunately, is unlikely to be beneficial to the world, let alone to developing countries.
Michelson?
Yeah, it's just one short comment. First of all, I don't think it's just the West. We have techno-nationalism that's also in this part of the world as well as elsewhere, and it is counterproductive. There's no doubt about it. We have another example of cooperation in the space program, although much less now, but certainly that moved the space program forward, led mainly by the Russians, the U.S. as well as other international contributors. But I really think what we need, and it may be unachievable, is the spirit of Bretton Woods. Not Bretton Woods again, but we're in a situation now where these issues that we've all raised are important enough that we have to find a way of cooperation. As I mentioned before, despite the differences we have even within Asia, I think Asia still is the best place, especially going forward, to take the lead in some of this area and to try to find a way that we can, at least maybe with small steps, start to move forward on some of these very crucial issues that will overwhelm us if we don't do that. So I hope it's a hopeful note, but it's also one that I think we have to worry about going forward.
Thank you. I think with this, we will actually conclude this wide-ranging discussion. The emphasis has to be on cooperation rather than settling down to cooperating within smaller compartments of the world, because the challenges we face are truly global, spanning the entirety of our existence. I think that seems to be what we have really concluded. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we come to an end of this session.
Thank you, Professor Sundaram, Professor Tong, and Professor Michelson for your interesting insights and views, and for Mr. Arun for conducting that session brilliantly. Ladies and gentlemen, stay tuned. We'll be going for a very short break, and we'll be starting with the next session in a few minutes itself. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. We are now ready to start with the second session of the day, which is a panel discussion on crisis after crisis, coordinating resilience. Please remember, you can always post your questions to the panelists using the Q&A button on the platform. Please join me in welcoming on the digital dais Mr. Fahad K. Chinoy, Chief Executive Officer, Pakistan Cables Limited, Mr. Siddhant Raj Pandey, Chairman and CEO, Business Oxygen Private Limited from Nepal, Mr. Nikhil Sani, Senior Vice President, AIMA, Vice Chairman and Managing Director, Triveni Turbine Limited, and Director, Triveni Engineering and Industries Limited, and our moderator for the session, Mr. Pranjal Sharma, Economic Analyst, Advisor, and Author. Before I hand over the proceedings to Mr. Pranjal Sharma, a few words about him. Mr. Pranjal is an economic analyst, advisor, and author with a focus on technology, globalization, and media. A former member of the Global Agenda Council at the World Economic Forum, he is a regular speaker at Davos. He is the author of several best-selling books and a columnist with Business Standard newspaper and Business World magazine. May I now request Pranjal to kindly introduce the speakers and also take the session forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Smita. Thanks so much for this. I think we have a great discussion ahead of us, mostly because the topic is such, and between Siddharth, Father Nikhil, we want to explore some of these issues, and I think all of us would agree that we thought COVID was terrible, and things would stabilize in life and global economy. And our society would be getting back to normal life, as it were. But the crisis just don't seem to end. And we've had a war. We now have economic situations with inflation. We have energy crisis in the Western world. And then, of course, while many of these crises are in the Western world, the impacts will be felt across the world. I think what I would request and discuss with Siddharth, Pad, and Nikhil is that share with us about first what has been the policy and what are the steps they took for resilience within their countries, within their organizations to begin with. And then we come to, later on, we'll try to unpack some of the issues around what are the learnings and how do we prepare ourselves for a world where the uncertainties will perhaps increase and be far more unanticipated, as it were. So Siddharth, I'd like to begin with you and request you to share some of your experience in what you managed, how the country was dealing with the crisis, but more importantly, what is the advice and suggestions you have as a leader for managing resilience? So over to you, Siddharth.
Thank you, Pranjal, and thank you, Asian Association of Management Organization, for giving us this platform. You see, 2 years ago, when we, not only as a nation, but globally faced the pandemic, it was unprecedented. Never, I don't think in history, had any nation state or globally faced supply side shock, demand side shock, and financial shock all together at once. I mean, for me as a private equity investor with a portfolio of 16 companies, that was a chaotic situation. Now we needed to address how our portfolio companies would rise to the occasion to deal with these problems. I mean, then you had the government, and normally when you're looking at governments in countries like Nepal, they're less prepared to deal with the situation than the private sector. The private sector's resilience has always driven countries like this forward. And unfortunately, instead of innovation leading regulation, innovation follows regulation in smaller countries, and it stifles growth in the process. But this COVID situation provided an incredible opportunity for the e-commerce platform to grow and proliferate. Among our companies, where if there was a supply chain disruption, for some companies there was a demand side lack for the others. Others faced HR problems, and others financials, lack of financial working capital, etc. So each had its own problem to bear. But what was consistent in this is that the companies that could identify the problems that they had and pivot to a innovative manner were the ones that sustained and flourished. For instance, I'll give you an example of some of our hospitality companies, restaurants, who pivoted from serving clientele in-house to providing online delivery systems to the houses, grocery systems, shops, etc., using the e-commerce platform. Okay, hotels that provided quarantine. It wasn't about the bottom line anymore. It was about maintaining the top line to get some revenue into the businesses. So the whole question was, how do we, as a private equity, intervene in helping these companies in their hour of need? Was to create a business continuity plan. Our foremost area was to ensure that their human resources were managed well, because tomorrow there would be a need for them when things settle down. And at that point, I don't think any of us realized how long this would last. I mean, it lasted almost 18 months. At that time, we all thought that it would be all done and gone with in a couple of months, and we'd be able to sustain it. But it was improbable, the gravity of the situation at that time. Then we had we ensured that there was expense management in the companies. Ensured that if companies, supply chain management, countries like ours were highly dependent on imports. It had stopped. Raw materials had stopped. Within and from external vendors, parts for factory machinery was not available, etc. So all these issues were things that we had to deal with, whether we could inject further capital into the companies to sustain them, etc. It was a very difficult situation. I don't think anyone can be prepared for something like this. I mean, if it was stopgap situation, yes, but it never ended. It kept on going on and on and on. Okay. Now, moving to the other side, right after going through all that pandemic problems, and then came the Ukraine war. Now, that brought about massive macroeconomic shocks. Okay. Countries like ours that are very dependent on imports, commodity prices went up. Our ability to furnish our debt has also gone up. But one thing that our government did is that it ensured that our debt, total debt of the nation would not exceed 45% of GDP. We didn't want to be in a Sri Lanka-like situation. Okay? But when you have commodities not being exported and countries turning inward to protect their own people, we had not been able to import grain, rice, and sugar from India, because India stopped those exports to countries outside Nepal, outside India. So these are issues that small nations are very dependent on. Okay, and how do you prevent that? Of course, 10, 20 years ago we were a net exporting agriculture country. Now we import everything, and what has helped us in terms of our foreign exchange is the remittances. That has anchored our economy, which is not a permanent solution, but for the situation as of now, that has helped us sustain ourselves. But moving forward, that has also creates inflationary pressures on countries like ours, because there's so much consumerism. We don't make anything, so we're dependent on all this. Actually, 70% of our international trade is with India, and we are on the top 10 exporting nations for India as well. So as the dollar rises, commodity prices start increasing. These are things that we need to start to be resilient towards. That we need to start giving more importance to our own manufacturing industries, to our SMEs. That's what we do. We deal with SMEs. We invest in them. We hold their hand. We prepare them towards international best practices. And the country should give more priority to these sectors and industrialization, and pivot more towards clean energy rather than oil imports and diesel imports and LPG gas. So, looking forward, it is a national agenda that we have to now start focusing on in order to remain sustainable, so that these sort of problems don't arise. Now, earlier discussions, they talked about how collaborative measures have to be furthered moving in the future. But because of what's happened with COVID and as well as the Ukraine war, countries are starting to look inwards, which is not a good sign. I think
No,
I've done
that's
my.
a good that's a good opening in terms of understanding how the shock and the after effects and how to overcome those. And we'll come to some of the learnings in as we develop the conversation. But Fahd, even for you, so many in the services sector were able to switch to a digital version of life and business, but for the manufacturing sector and your sector, perhaps the digital version is not something which is suitable. I mean, you can't replace cable. In fact, the digital world depends on cables. So, how did your organization develop this resilience? Some part is always there in organizations, but it has to be reinforced and strengthened. So, from your perspective, what was the steps taken at your organization with the leadership?
Thank you, Pranjal. I think just taking a step back, I want to sort of touch upon what happened at the policy level first, and then sort of drill down in terms of what we did. So Pakistan was actually quite lucky, I think, in terms of how much COVID impacted us. I don't know what happened, but the numbers over here were relatively better than a lot of the numbers globally as well as in the region. The government acted quite fast and took two policy steps which really kept the wheels of the economy turning. One was a subsidized financing for importing equipment, sort of looking forward, even though we're in an import-centric economy, and that later, I think, bit us, but at that point in time seemed to be a very progressive step. So that sort of encouraged investment into future projects. The other thing was that the government, to ensure that jobs were not lost, also provided subsidized financing, whereby it made more sense to take the subsidized loan and keep people on versus letting people go. So we managed to keep employment relatively unemployment relatively under control, and the wheels of the economy turning. But I think, as was pointed out, I don't think that there's anything that one could have done to have preempt this. Certainly, there are lessons that have been learned. I think our response was that, firstly, it was an unprecedented situation, and the immediate sort of knee-jerk reaction was to shut industry down. And so immediately what we needed to do was try to get our operations back up and running, and that required a lot of work. We were, in fact, one of the first companies in Pakistan to get up and running again. So I think we were quite agile and nimble in responding to the situation. And you can have all the risk registers and heat maps in the world, but at the end of the day, it really depends on how you execute when things happen. And so, of course, we had to understand what others were doing. I think virtual meetings, working from home, all of that became a way of life. But critically, what we had to do was get our operations up and running. We have customers who are, they have time-sensitive projects, and they have penalties built into contracts. And even though one could have declared force majeure, one did not want to go down that route, given the credibility of our company. So we managed to get operational again. I think that allowed us to sort of build on our disaster recovery or risk program a little bit more, and sort of strengthen it so that we were, we had a more robust response for future changes. But as Siddhant pointed out, then there were swings, right? So you had this depression that came in with respect to a grinding halt to the economy, supported by some policy which tried to get the wheels of the economy turning. And then when one started to come out of the haze of COVID, there was this commodity super cycle, and there was this pent-up demand, a surge of pent-up demand. So you're going from being extremely slow demand side to being almost extremely aggressive, and I don't think anyone anticipated that. So it was also the response to how quickly one could, get one's operations to be able to support that increase in demand. And then again, today we find ourselves in a situation where we are a debt-stressed economy, import-centric, in the middle of trying to get an IMF program up and operational. Again, we've had severe floods that's impacting our ability to pay back our debt. And so, right from being in the frying pan to being in the fire. And I think that's now the new challenge on our agenda, the how do we sort of navigate the circumstances that are being played out as we speak. And very frankly, the floods, have been severe. I don't think that the extent of it has been acknowledged internally within Pakistan, and I don't think that we're doing enough at a government or policy level to address that. There's more of a focus on political issues and so on, as opposed to a flood response. But I think there are lessons to be learned over there. And when we talk about COVID being unprecedented and, the world not having, maybe the tools to respond immediately, and there was a learning curve, climate change doesn't, present that challenge. That has been the writing has been on the wall with climate change for a long time. And whatever models were developed in terms of how quickly it progressed, it's progressing a lot faster than that. So I think our biggest challenge now going forward is how can we pivot towards sustainability and addressing climate change? Because particularly in our region, I think everyone has a challenge over here. Bangladesh has been challenged, Pakistan has been challenged. We have extreme weather patterns in India. We have the smog situation, which is, very much a unique situation to this particular part of the world. So I think that's the next challenge on the horizon. Of course, all these things are interlinked, but there was a lot to learn from COVID and how we responded to what we can do with respect to addressing climate change and trying to ensure that it doesn't really impact our region and the world as a whole.
Thanks, Man. I think we'll talk about collaboration and the Asian response, but I'd like to bring in Nikhil's view here. Nikhil, perhaps you could share with us how you see the response from corporate India, your own company, and India in terms of responding in a constructive way to the uncertainties and lingering chaos in the markets and in the geopolitical ecosystem.
Thank you, Pranjal. Firstly, a very warm hello to Siddhant and Fahad, and thank you very much for having me on this 21st Triennial AAMO conference, and a big congratulations to the chair for this past 3 years as well. Pranjal, as you know, India's government took a very progressive view in terms of ensuring that there was a business continuity for certain essential industries post the initial lockdowns of COVID being detected. At the same time, they took a very humanitarian view towards those who were more marginalized and provided different assurances in terms of access to essential food and services of health, etc. Now, having come through it, I think just to skip a couple of steps, I think both Siddhant and Fahad have spoken about the different issues of lockdowns and reopenings. The country managed, I think, quite well by being prudent on liquidity and on infusion of fiscal, some discipline. That's paid off quite well for the country because it's held itself in a situation now where it has the flexibility to use both monetary and fiscal measures to help stimulate as well as help navigate through certain crises which it's facing at this current point in time, primarily being inflation at this current point. For us as a company, as we provide a spectrum of products and services which were considered essential, we did continue our operations, and our dealings with over 350,000 farmers on a near daily basis was an immense challenge in terms of being able to maintain social distancing while still being able to provide for their livelihood. This was a challenge which Siddhant also did point to, is that we addressed through an increased use of digitization. And innovation happened at the grassroots level where we were able to implement it immediately. We were also able to use some of those learnings in some of our service offerings, such as where our turbines needed to be installed. As Fahad talked about, no one wanted to go into a situation of force majeure on contracts. But as we were installing turbines in Germany, for example, we had to use augmented reality and a variety of different means, which all focused around digitization. An increased digitization of the value chain was imperative for us to be able to deliver what was our commitment to our customers. But through this entire learning, Pranjal, I think that hopefully we could have a little discussion, not only on the areas of sustainability, where I believe there's an immense need for cooperation amongst member countries as well as companies. But what we found is that there was a huge degree of compassion that came out through the learning of COVID. We found that while we may deal with different stakeholders, people were able to be flexible. And I think that degree of compassion is something that should be leveraged now as we move towards an era of greater cooperation, especially on a South-South basis. In this AAMO, in the South Asian context, it's imperative that we build on some degree of bonhomie that we have. It may not happen at a geopolitical level, but I think as we get down micro to the SMEs, to the corporates, as we look at their value chains in terms of what assistance is needed to help mitigate future risks, I think it's important to have that backdrop. But net, Pranjal, as you know, I think that India is in a quite a comfortable situation right now. As the government moved towards formalization of the economy, an increased use of digitization unfortunately meant that those companies which were larger were able to benefit more from the formalization of the economy, which has gotten a spur through COVID. Unfortunately, what that means is that the small and medium enterprises, which were less formal and more informal in the operating structure, have not been as quick to build their resilience in their entire value chain.
That's well said, Nikhil. I'm extremely optimistic about our part of the world. And, we've had crisis, the floods in Pakistan, the economic crisis in Sri Lanka. However, I think our ability in our part of the world to bounce back is far better. I foresee that the challenges, economic and social challenges in the developed world, Western world, are going to be far worse. I mean, look at the energy crisis, which are very fundamental to it. I'm also positive that, Asian countries are diversifying their energy basket. There's far more resilience. There's far more focus now on self-reliance. And I think that's perhaps the way forward. And I'd like to, ask all of you to share your thoughts on what can be done. I mean, we are the region which is going to grow the fastest in the world. We are the region where we have young, consuming, aspirational populations, which means that the economic drivers and the fundamentals of economic drivers are in place, unlike what we can see in the West. In your view, what are the 2 or 3 steps that can be taken to ensure that Asian countries from Southeast Asia to Middle East to where we are in South Asia, what are the success stories of collaboration and how can we build on these? So I'll open it to all 3 of you, Nikhil, Siddharth, and Fahd. Please come in.
I'll take a first stab at it then, Pranjal. I think there are various areas where cooperation can exist, and I'd like to focus on company-to-company cooperation rather than some geopolitical narrative where I don't have any expertise to speak on. I believe that certain areas in terms of research and development, which has become a very fast-changing and an extremely important area for building a more relevant product and service to a customer, needs to have a more diversified base of talent. I think the fact that you see at this point in time of war of technologies and what was spoken about at the fag end of the previous session is that really the wars of tomorrow are going to be around technology, and to the greatest extent that you can have collaboration around R&D so as to establish platforms and standards which are common across different boundaries would allow for a greater degree of common prosperity. And so therefore, by doing joint research and development into areas of standards, I think is extremely important to be able to help bridge and ultimately build a more resilient ecosystem.
I think which also means that companies in Asia have to look at other parts. There is a whole lot of investment flowing in because of the value chain, which Siddharth was referring to. There's a reorganization of the value chain across the world, right? Investors who were only looking at China were looking at other alternatives. So basically a rebalancing. I mean, people say it's deglobalization. I call it reglobalization, where there is far better balancing of trade and investment flows. They are not unidirectional, they are multidirectional. And I think Asia will play a very important role in this. So any thoughts on this, Siddhant?
Yes, especially recently, we started exporting hydropower to India. And this was a first of its kind. We're also negotiating with Bangladesh for exports. Initially we were deficit in energy, and we used to import electricity from India, but now we've started exporting as well. And there's a lot of unique selling points that smaller countries have that can provide in the South Asian region. IT is one big area that Nikhil mentioned, digitization. Nepal is now slowly pivoting towards creating IT talent, AI talent that provides engineers and computer scientists all over the world. So that is a huge benefit, and we have to look into it. But having said that, climate is going to be the big white elephant in the room that is going to haunt us all. I mean, unfortunate what has happened in Pakistan recently. We're seeing nasty monsoon flooding every summer that we never saw before. Our glacial lakes are bursting, and downstream hydropower companies, installations are being washed away. So we need to make sure that, collectively, how do we fight this? I mean, Nepal, for instance, is 0.02% of global carbon emissions.
Siddhant, if I can come in here, and maybe Parth will come on. There is a very strong school of thought which believes that the global South is paying the price, climate-wise, for the sins of the global North. So if you see climate change impact today of unpredictable weather systems, it's because the previous 50 years, there was an absolute exploitation of the nature, not by the developing countries, not by the global South, because we're still per capita the lowest polluters in the world, but really the global North. And therefore, we are not only bearing the brunt of what was done in the West, in the developed world, but we are now also expected to carry the can for the future in terms of not investing in our development, and that's actually putting Asia in a very difficult position. Any thoughts on this, Parth?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's certainly the narrative that Pakistan has recently, been sort of projecting at the global level. The reality is that indeed that probably is the case, and the statistics point to that, but what can we do about it, right? And so, of course, there needs to be a collective narrative whereby the voice of the region becomes more strongly felt as opposed to the voice of one particular country. And today it's Pakistan, tomorrow it could be any other country, and we've seen signs of that. So indeed, I think that if we could collectively as a region make a little bit more noise, that would have more of an impact. Ultimately, I think, as pointed out, IT is certainly a way forward for progress, and this region is sort of well positioned to take advantage of that. India is a great model, and certainly in Pakistan, there's been a lot of conversation around how we can sort of replicate or follow some of the best practices that took place in India for IT and developing the sector. And then clearly the other area is agriculture, food security, water as well. I think they talk about wars being fought over water, and Pakistan has certainly been stressed. I mean, we've had extremes with floods, but we've also had semi-droughts, and we've had forest fires as well recently. So, it's a kaleidoscope of issues. And while each country needs to also sort of build resilience around their own food security and water situation, at the end of the day, it's all sort of connected. And where does the the corporate sector or the industrial sector come in here? Particularly where there are political challenges, or there is, let's say, policy that vacillates from time to time. It's the corporate sector which has the privileged position to be able to take a consistent approach. And I think that's really where, whether it's regional collaboration or even just setting the benchmark, that's where one has to take steps to at least create change. Everyone in their pockets, or at least some organizations in their pockets, are inculcating sustainability programs and rolling out certain initiatives, but it's not at a cohesive level. And I'll give you an example. At Pakistan Cables, we're setting up a new factory. It's pretty much in the desert, about an hour and a half away from Karachi. but we've grown an urban forest on 3 acres, 40,000 trees, just to set a sort of benchmark for the rest of the industry and present some kind of an example to say that, look, it's not a huge amount of money. It creates purpose within the organization. It creates narrative in terms of people understanding that the organization is not simply about making or selling cables. And it also, it also makes you then someone who could sit at potentially the policy level and whether it's this initiative or other initiatives like bringing in carbon friendly products that could sort of, have an impact on our electrical distribution and transmission system. Everyone has a role to play. The problem is, where does the cohesion come in? And I think that's where we need to figure out whether it's going to be, as Nikhil said, at a company to company level, or whether there's some regional collaboration that can develop around that.
We are talking about a lot of C's. We are talking about cohesion. We're talking about climate, but let's also talk about collaboration. I've got a couple of questions here from some of the delegates who are listening in to us right now, from Louisa Jackson and Mariam Durrani. And a very interesting question is about collaborating between countries, but can, for example, companies in our region collaborate with each other? Can we create regional corridors of business? So we also have to reduce our dependence on the West. If we are looking at a recession in the West, then Asia, which is standing tall right now, has to deepen its own strengths, which means that can countries from West Asia to East Asia to South Asia, can they come across and do business with each other? Intra-region linkages, what needs to be done to strengthen these? And I'll leave it again to all three of you. Any of you would like to come in on what has worked and what needs to be done to improve that?
Well, let me start. Especially for countries like mine, Nepal, we have some capital constraint laws that we cannot invest in another country outside Nepal. We can trade with them, but we cannot go and have a joint venture abroad. So, policy changes have to happen. Now, there's a lot of geopolitics going on in this region as well that we have to be cognizant about, you see. And that has been a big hurdle towards free trading and free sort of associations moving forward. But like I mentioned earlier, hydropower is a huge potential for us, and we've started exporting it for the first time this year. And we plan to increase that. Digitization is a platform that needs no boundaries. That is happening, I think, all over. Bangladesh is incredible in its exports of garments. And even now, digital platform has expanded there. Pakistan is also a leader in that area. So if we can collaborate, the key word is collaboration amongst ourselves. But then, it's not that simple being in South Asia where, there's a lot of geopolitical tensions among nation states as well. That has been a hurdle towards that collaboration.
But these tensions are there in every region, Siddhant, and the idea is to work through them. But therefore, perhaps the responsibility lies on business. I mean, there are, and a question from Jagdish Khatri here says there are, there's ASEAN, there's SAARC, there is RCEP. So there are various ways in which one is the multilateral groupings that we see, or regional trade bodies, but there's also the option for companies to individually come together. So Nikhil, do you see corporate collaboration taking momentum within Asia, trade and investment within Asia happening? So why can't companies from Pakistan and Nepal work in Southeast Asia with West Asia? Do you see that as the way ahead?
Most definitely, Pranjal. I think that as we look at especially the constituents of AAMO and Asia, this is where the growth is going to be for the next century. Everyone recognizes that based on its demographic and socioeconomic tailwinds. I think the fact is that when you look at the entire delivery of a product and solution, there are many different aspects to it. The fact that you have growing markets in whichever market we do operate, cross-border intercompany cooperation, I think is essential. and even more so in third-party jurisdictions. Like you say, get an Indian and Nepalese company together to do work in Burma, Myanmar, sorry. These are ideas that I think have found its time of light in the time of day. I think it is important that we look a little broader in our perspective as to how we could further these collaborations. Ultimately, it is people-to-people exchange, a greater amount of interpersonal exchanges, which will lead to a greater degree of confidence and trust to be able to put those collaborations together. Will those take a form of a joint venture? Too early to say. I would think that contractual relationships would be the start of it. It could be in the form of agency, but then subsequently taking forms of equity relationships, much as Siddhant had said. But I think that there's enormous opportunity to not only leverage cost bases that different companies may have, but more so the talent base that companies have to be able to deliver a greater solution at the end of the day.
Fahd, do you want to come on this?
Sure. I just want to say that, in individual country levels, we have corporate bodies, like we have the Management Association of Pakistan, or the Pakistan Business Council, etc. And that's where there is collaboration opportunities and learning opportunities between companies. And there's no reason why we can't do that at a regional level as well, just like this particular forum. So if, for example, we could have a neutral location where people could get together, there could be certain issues and opportunities for people to network, learn from one another, and then potential collaboration. Now, of course, there's certain restrictions between countries, whether that's trade or whether that's collaboration, but there's certainly no restriction on learning. And I think that's where, that's a good starting point. There are neutral locations that one could use, and certainly these kind of corporate platforms could set the tone for the way forward.
I think, go ahead, Siddhant, please.
India is our largest investor in FDI in Nepal. We have the largest companies that they have invested in. They're singularly the largest FDI investor. And but unfortunately, we don't have that among other South Asian countries. Now, there is a lot to learn from one another, you see. What happens in the Hindu Kush affects the entire region, whether, the floodings in Bangladesh or the floodings in Pakistan, Nepal, so there has to be a more sort of a joint sort of collaboration between the private sector. The government is doing, there's SARC, but SARC has turned more into a talk fest rather than an implementing agency. So I think I see more hope in the private sector getting together to solve each other's problems rather than from the government level.
So let's close. We have a few minutes left. I'm going to request all of you to give us one learning from the past, a learning which can be applied for the future in terms of collaboration, in terms of resilience, in terms of ensuring that, perhaps an Asia first policy, not just at the national level, but at the corporate level as well. So I'm going to request each of you to come back and share that one learning, beginning with you, Siddhant.
Well, from what's happened with the pandemic and now the Ukraine crisis, I think we have started to learn that we cannot be singular and unilateral in the way we approach the economy, our businesses. We need to have open-mindedness. We need to prepare for the future. We need to stockpile on what we need to keep our businesses going. And we need to be innovative constantly. We need to find that pivot to move from one area to the other in order to be facilitating as well as sustainable in this ever-changing system where there are controllables and there are uncontrollables. And right now, all of us are in a situation where things are beyond our control. The war in Ukraine that has created enormous inflationary measures is affecting the average man to nation states. How do you control that? So these are things that I think we need to start thinking about. And of course, we need to start working amongst each other. But then there are limitations. Like I said, countries are going to look at what's beneficial for their countries. within before they start exporting things which other countries may be reliant on. You can't expect them to help others when they can't help themselves. So, self-reliance is something that we have to start working towards, become, in our case, less consumer oriented, more manufacturing, more export orientated, etc.
That's a good thought, Siddharth. I think self-reliance does not mean withdrawing from the world, but it just means strengthening your own feet to be able to stand and then do business with others on an equal footing. That's a great point. Parth?
Yeah, I think COVID was a real wake-up call for the whole world, and certainly, as I pointed out earlier, the climate change is definitely happening, and the horizon is pretty clear. I think that certain organizations or certain countries will be more responsible, and others will be less responsible, and that depends on their individual situations. And really, I think it's key to try and build a financial incentive into it for organizations or countries to shift in a more sort of carbon neutral, carbon friendly direction. So green financing for me, if at a global level or at a regional level, or carbon markets, I think these two areas could help be a catalyst for change faster than otherwise, depending on regional intercompany cooperation or through corporate bodies. I think there needs to be some sort of a financial incentive built in to make people shift direction faster than the way things are happening right now.
Thanks, Parth. I think a collaboration on climate financing within the region would be a great learning for us. Thank you. Nikhil?
Thanks, Pranjal. I completely agree with Fahd. Cooperation on carbon markets also is equally important, which is a mechanism.
So what's the one learning you would like to share with us?
Yeah, but you see, Pranjal, as most businesses in Asia are family run. The degree of resilience from a capital structure perspective has always been there within family enterprises, regardless of if they're listed or not. So the fact is that, but we have to change the view of resilience from a capital structure perspective to the operations of the business. And that, I think, is a real change of focus that has taken place right now through a variety of different means. For us itself, and our greatest learning has been to drill down your balance sheet and P&L to see where innovation can actually play its role. And I think that degree of innovation, which has to be pushed at every different level, is something that we think is the paramount focus for us going forward.
Thank you, Nikhil, and thanks, Siddharth and Parth, for sharing your thoughts and experiences with us. There's so much more to unpack, but I hope that we can continue this conversation in person in the coming days. And thanks to all of you for joining in this morning for this chat. With this, I'll end this session and hand it over back to AIMA.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pranjal, for conducting that session. And thank you again to all the panelists for sharing your insights on how coordination can help build resilience within the region. Ladies and gentlemen, with this, we have come to the end of this session, but please do remain connected as the final session of the day will begin in a few minutes at 11:50 Indian Standard Time, which is 6:20 Greenwich Mean Time for our international audience. Thank you and do stay tuned. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. Welcome back to the last session of AAMO's 21st Triennial Conference. It is my pleasure, and please join me in welcoming on stage our three speakers, Mr. Rajiv Kaul, President AAMO and Chairman Nico Engineering Services Private Limited, Mr. Srinivas Dempo, President AIMA and Chairman Dempo Group of Companies, and Mr. S.K. Cheong, Vice President AAMO and Deputy Chairman Hong Kong Management Association. Before we begin, it is my honor to quickly introduce Mr. Rajiv Kaul to you once again. Mr. Kaul is the chairman of Nico Engineering Services Limited and founder promoter of Nico Parks and Resorts Limited. He is a former honorary consul general of the Republic of Korea, a position he has held for over 20 years. He has held leadership positions in several industry bodies and also served on the boards of some of India's leading educational institutes. Mr. Kaul is also actively involved in his philanthropic endeavors and is associated with some of India's leading charitable trusts. It is my pleasure now to request Mr. Rajiv Kaul to deliver the introductory remarks.
Thank you, Smita. Mr. Srinivas Dempo, President AIMA and Chairman Dempo Group of Companies, Mr. S.K. Cheong, Vice President AAMO and Deputy Chairman Hong Kong Management Association, and a friend of mine for the last few years, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great pleasure to have you in the valedictory session of the Triennial AAMO Conference. Mr. Srinivas Dempo, it is a special pleasure for me to have you, and many thanks for agreeing to address our conference. As President AIMA, you are the leader of India's management fraternity, and you are a great ambassador for Indian management to the world. Being an outstanding business leader, you helm one of India's most expansive conglomerates. The House of Dempo, which you head, is a player in several sectors, including petroleum coke, shipbuilding, food processing, real estate, newspaper publishing, and sports. You and your family are synonymous with social, cultural, environmental, and education initiatives in your home state, Goa, and you are involved with important philanthropic organizations such as the Charles Correa Foundation, the Goa Cancer Society, the Dempo Charities Trust, and the Vasant Rao Dempo Education and Research Foundation. You're a modern business leader who has successfully blended business priorities with social and environmental causes. Thank you very much once again for joining us, and a very warm welcome to you, sir. Mr. Chong Shin Kong, it is a pleasure to have you, and many thanks for agreeing to deliver the concluding remarks and vote of thanks. You are a truly outstanding business leader, and you're renowned for your achievements in Hong Kong's media, advertising, and marketing sectors. In Hong Kong media sectors, you shoulder several responsibilities simultaneously, including those of the Vice Chairman of the Hong Kong Television Entertainment Company and independent non-executive director of Bossini International Holdings and a member of the Audit and Remuneration Committee and Nomination Committees of Bossini. Earlier, you had served as the General Manager and Executive Director of Television Broadcast Limited. You have been a pillar of Hong Kong's Management Association for 3 decades, and you have been the chairman of the Hong Kong Regional Board of the Chartered Institute of Marketing. Thank you, sir. And a special and very warm welcome to you. Ladies, gentlemen, and friends, this has been truly an outstanding conference, and we have had excellent discussions on both global and regional issues. We have heard some exceptional leaders, and we have learned to look at the prevailing conditions and the future with greater clarity and even more confidence. The fact that we are still meeting virtually is a reminder that the COVID pandemic is not over, and while it is possible once again to travel a bit, but it is still often complicated. For much of this year, the world has been confronted with new specters of war and inflation on top of the ongoing COVID. The swing round in the US monetary policy is pulling a lot of pressure on all of us as global money is being sucked out of Asian economies, thereby putting great pressure on all of us. The depreciation of Asian currencies is adding to inflation in the cost of energy, food, production, as also consumption. Asian central banks are burning their dollar reserves to steady their currencies and try and stabilize their foreign debt levels. The situation has once again reminded Asian countries to review their dependence on the dollar and perhaps work out an alternative payment arrangement for intra-regional trade. There is also a need for regional cooperation in finance and payment mechanisms, given the caprice of the existing global flows and payment systems. Asia also needs a dispersal of its supply chains and diversification of its markets. The concentration of supply chains in particular country or sub-region have proven to be vulnerable to national situations and policies. The dispersal of suppliers would be efficient and cost-effective if it is done in cooperation with each other and not to gain at each other's expense. While capital and factories are portable, expertise is less so because of strong immigration barriers in Asia. Also, not all layers of supply chain can be transferred from existing locations to new ones, especially the micro and small enterprises. This reality requires Asian countries to cooperate in redistributing supply chains for resilience and coordinate our supply chains for efficiency. Though Asia's intra-regional trade is growing, it can grow much faster. There are significant mutual barriers to market access, and these need to be resolved to keep our Asian economies rocketing along, even if and when Western economies run out of growth because of their demographics and their regional politics. This conference rightly focused on Asia's transition and regional cooperation in a changing world. I am confident that everybody enjoyed the discussions. I certainly did, and benefited from the various speakers' observations and prescriptions. In this session, we have further opportunity to hear the perspectives of top business leaders from India as also Hong Kong. However, before that, I want to express my gratitude to all my colleagues at both AAMO and AIMA for all their support during my presidency at AAMO. I welcome and offer my best wishes to Mr. Chong, who takes over from me very shortly, and I assure him of all my unstinted support to both him personally as also to AAMO. It is now my pleasure to invite Mr. Srinivas Dempo, a very dear friend of mine and president of AIMO and chairman of Dempo Group of Companies, to address our conference. Over to you, Srini.
Thank you, Rajiv, and thank you for those very kind words you said about me. Rajiv has been a good friend for many, many years, and you know, he's been now the president of AAMO and he's also the chairman of Nico Engineering Services. And I've known him for, I think, more than 2 decades now. So it's been an absolute pleasure to work with him on various forums. Mr. S.K. Chong, nice to meet you for the first time, though I would have loved to meet you physically over this Triennial Conference, but hopefully we can have one in Hong Kong very soon. But it's a real pleasure to meet with you online, and I would like to extend my congratulations to you in advance for the presidentship of AAMO that you will take over shortly.
Thank you.
And ladies and gentlemen, it's indeed a unique pleasure and my privilege to be able to attend this 21st Triennial Conference of AAMO. And I thank AAMO for giving me an opportunity to express my views at this conference. I would like to first congratulate the current AAMO president, Mr. Rajiv Kaul, on his outstanding leadership under extremely trying circumstances. Rajiv, it was not easy to run AAMO during COVID, and now, of course, during other pressures that we are facing about geopolitics. But I know that you've steered AAMO through not only the prolonged COVID disruption, but also ensured continuity of the core AAMO activities and engagement among Asia's national management organizations. Thank you, Rajiv, for shouldering this responsibility. On behalf of AIMA, I would like to congratulate you and keeping the organization in good shape, despite constraints on travels and events that we've talked about earlier. We are very, very grateful to you, Rajiv. I also compliment Mr. S.K. Chong, who has excelled as Vice President AAMO. I'm confident that under his leadership now, AAMO will recover strongly from the disruption and provide the necessary thought leadership for management transformation in the region. I also compliment all the members, that is NMOs, for staying engaged with AAMO during this trying period through digital means and continuing the exchange of ideas and expertise for all our mutual benefit. AIMA, I'm sure, and I assure you, will continue to contribute to AAMO's agenda and efforts, and our organization is committed to strengthening regional cooperation in Asia, something that has been the theme of this conference so far. AAMO's role, I feel, is particularly becoming important as Asia becomes the center stage of global economic and political action. As we were discussing earlier, Mr. Chong, you know that all of us believe that the next few decades are going to be Asia's. And what would be AAMO's leadership to provide inputs, management inputs, thought leadership to sort of broaden this agenda and for Asia to really have leadership? Asia is where the economic growth is going to be and will be over the next few decades. And the world, I feel, will depend on Asia's growth to keep its economic engine going. With economic strength also comes political attention and attrition. Asia is where the old and emerging powers will collide and jostle for territorial, economic, and technological hegemony. The huge opportunities in Asia are tinged with worries about the region's fragmentation and the resulting drag on its economic growth. AAMO and other Pan-Asian organizations, I feel, must intervene and ensure regional solidarity and cooperation. While the COVID crisis underscored the centrality of Asia to the world, it also exposed the vulnerability of Asia because of the concentration of supply chains in this part of the world. There has been a clamor in the West to bring manufacturing back because of the issues that we mentioned. And they also want to keep the cutting edge technologies at home. The war in Ukraine and the resulting polarization of trade and finance have provided further notice to Asia to rethink its supply chain concentration and finance options. It would seem that decentralizing supply chains within the region, broadening the inter-regional trade, and finding alternatives to the dollar would allow both greater resilience and lasting growth in Asia. Since the 2008 financial crisis, China has dominated the Western imagination because of its success in providing a lot of the global economic growth and saving the Western world from much worse economic and political turmoil. The US has definitely and decisively pivoted to Asia, and Europe has also followed. While the increased economic interest in Asia would be generally welcome, it comes with a geopolitical rider, with China claiming to be a regional and global superpower there is considerable unease about its moves, and that threatens to upset maybe the Asian apple cart. The larger Asia now finds itself juggling regional and global relationships, and Asia's great promise has acquired a little bit of degree of uncertainty. There is clear need for increasing Asia's economic integration by replacing the narrow national and sub-regional aspirations with pan-Asia mega-regionalism. Much of the value from the concentration of economic activity has already been extracted, and the way to sustain the region's high growth is to enlarge the footprint of the regional economy and disperse the regional power wider. Asian countries must learn from history and not test the value of cooperation by first testing each other's strengths and resolve. Asia of the 21st century must avoid a repeat of the 20th century Europe. COVID has driven home the importance of regional cooperation, I feel. It reminded that there are issues that transcend borders and must be tackled collectively. It is important for us not to forget that during COVID, distances became oppressive and neighborhoods offered the most pertinent solutions. According to ADB's Regional Integration Report, in 2020, the trade linkages within South and East Asia and the Pacific grew, while their global linkages declined. Even though COVID is fading, the global buyers are casting their eyes wider for sourcing. However, they are not looking to move lock, stock, and barrel and are looking for proximate alternatives in Asia. Many global companies have already dispersed their manufacturing bases as economic and political risks of sticking with the existing locations are rising. The suppliers themselves are spreading out to many of the neighboring countries. This dispersal would work only through greater regional cooperation in Asia, as it would involve cross-border movement of capital, intellectual property, factories, and also maybe the workforce. India has emerged now as one of the favorite destinations of buyers and suppliers who now see Asia also beyond China. While India is not a classic manufacturing nation, which tend to have unchallenged rules and rulers, India offers insurance against the whims of the permanent leaders and single-party states. India already has a proven track record in cognitive excellence, being the world's favorite IT destination, R&D, and back office destination. India's government is doing its utmost to turn India into global manufacturing base through various incentives such as the PLIs, which we call the production linked incentives, manufacturing friendly labor laws, and a general ease of doing business, which has gone up substantially. India is also trying to work out snap trade agreements to capitalize on the window of opportunity created by post-COVID and post-Ukraine reorganization of the global economy. However, no country can benefit from an opportunity alone or by itself. Every country needs linkages with other countries in its region and must allow others also to benefit from its opportunities. The story of China's economic revolution would not exist without the role played by investors and experts from other Asian countries. India is trying to reach out to the emerging economies in Asia for effective partnerships for regional investment and trade. The rest of Asia also needs to recognize that India is the next gateway to the global markets and technologies. In any case, India is the centerpiece of the US's pivot to Asia, and it is emerging as the new Asian base of the Western companies to look for outsourced manufacturing and also intellectual work. India's own market, skill and technology base is huge, and other regional economies, I feel, can tap into these resources. There are growing opportunities for the countries in the Indo-Pacific region to cooperate, and these partnerships will prove critical in adapting to the emerging world order. Asia, I feel, needs to upgrade regional travel and logistics infrastructure, integrate payment and communication systems, and harmonize standards and rules to improve regional cooperation. Something that I think I was fortunate enough to listen to part of the earlier session before we started. And I think a lot has been touched upon regional cooperation. While a regional free trade, travel and currency zone like that of the EU looks unlikely for the moment or for the foreseeable future, Asian countries need to open up to each other much, much more. Seeing the cross-border relations through the lens of mutual grievances instead of mutual opportunities has constrained regional cooperation in some key parts of Asia. And Asians need to drive looking ahead and not backwards. It took Europeans 2 cataclysmic wars in the past century to outgrow nationalism and develop region-first attitude. Being open to trade, investment in immigration is more likely to expand the pie for everyone, whereas trying to capture a larger piece of a smaller pie would reduce what everyone gets. Trade is the engine of regional cooperation and strength. And as Asian trades gets redistributed, Asian countries need to think as a region and institute formal structures and systems for governance of regional trade. China has tried to lead the creation of regional infrastructure and institutions of trade through so many projects, such as the Belt and Road Initiative, which is also known as One Belt, One Road, and also the RECP, that's the Regional Cooperation of Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. But its leadership has been hobbled by its own territorial and governance missteps. India has rejected China's initiatives and is also wary of the US-sponsored alternative to RECP, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. India's stand has always been clear that any regional or global cooperation must provide a level playing field and not be tilted towards the sponsor. India has said that it would consider joining the IPEF once its concerns are taken care of. India is trying to balance its national aspirations within its regional interests, and it recognizes that something like the IPEF potentially offers preferred access to the largest regional grouping in Asia with 40% of the global GDP share. In comparison, RECP grouping accounts for about 28% of the global GDP. The future economic growth in Asia will depend a lot on collaborating and cooperating on technological transformation of the region. Being offline is not an option anymore, and having isolated networks, I feel, is pointless. Inevitably, the bulk of the world economy is getting networked, and data flows are determining value creation and trade. Technologies also are changing very fast, and all countries must keep up with the latest infrastructure, practices, and standards to stay on these networks. Cooperating in development and adoption of new digital and communication technologies is going to be critical for our national economies in the coming years. There's also a need, because of this, to coordinate laws and rules for data creation, storage, and flows for the border agnostic digital economy to function effectively. Multilateral agreements are, I feel, a must in this digital age. With digital integration, Asia needs to explore some level of financial integration. The reliance of economic stability on the temper of the American dollar and the recent unilateral decision of Russia, exclusion of Russia from global payment system, are reminders to Asia that it is not only the supply chains that require resilience. Financial resilience requires a greater use of local currencies, given the rising share of intra-regional trade in Asia. While fiscal policy would always remain focused on local economy and politics, there can be an effort, I feel, to coordinate monetary policies, especially during strong spillovers from action, as we have seen from the US and European central banks. There's a vast room for regional cooperation, particularly in Asia, on a wide range of issues. And I feel organizations like AAMO must provide the necessary thought leadership for managing national economic and business issues. It's critical that Asian countries recognize that they cannot change their location and therefore must prioritize problem solving at a regional level, even as they pursue their common national interests. Once again, I congratulate AAMO on its outstanding mission. I feel that Rajiv set up the theme of this session, particularly when he said that as Asia, we must think big, we must look at regional cooperation, we must look at how we could lessen the hassles with immigration, lessen the hassles with supply chain. And I think AAMO has a wonderful opportunity here to provide the necessary management expertise and thought leadership, not only to business management leaders, but also to political leaders, and really carry on this mission of making Asia a more powerful continent in the years to come. Once again, thank you, AAMO, thank you, Rajiv, and thank you, Mr. Chong, for inviting me to express my views on this special occasion. And I wish you all the best for the coming year. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Dempo. May I now request Mr. S.K. Cheong to deliver the concluding remarks and the vote of thanks.
Okay, thank you, Smita. Well, it is my most pleasurable duty indeed to give thanks for I think the wonderful, thought-provoking and visionary ideas that have been shared with us today. There's a lot to thank for. Let me make sure I get the order right. I think first and foremost, Mr. Dempo, I am extremely grateful personally, and I think on behalf of AAMO, extremely grateful for your sharing just now. I think you have given us the entire intellectual and logical framework for thinking about Asian cooperation. Most of the discussion, it completely synchronizes and jives with everything we've said today. So I don't think, Rajiv, we could have hoped for a better concluding address than the one that Mr. Dempo just gave us to sum up the thoughts that we should keep in our mind moving forward about cooperation, the need for cooperation, and Asia's role in the global economy moving forward. So I sincerely thank you, Mr. Dempo, for that wonderful sharing. I could not think of any other better way of putting it and a more inspiring way of expressing the thought. I want to also thank you for a few other things. First of all, I think for the great support that AIMA has given to AAMO over the years. I think AIMA has been a great inspiration to the other national management organizations around the region. It's a great inspiration for us in Hong Kong. And your offer of continued support is extremely valuable, most welcome, and also very motivating to us. And I look forward to that as we move forward to really realize the thoughts that we brought about today. I think, the regional cooperation can happen at several levels. It can happen at the level of the governments. It can happen at the level of the chambers of commerce, and it can happen at the level of individual companies and also national management organizations. And I think as I reflect on all the discussions today, I realize that there is a special role that national management organizations can build through the, as you quite rightly pointed out, the sharing of management expertise and thought leadership. I think these are the two areas where each national management organization has tremendous influence in its respective market. And through our trusting and sincere communications and effective communications, we can really engender and be a great catalyst for enhanced Asian cooperation moving forward. So I recognize from everything that you have said and everything that's been discussed today, that there is indeed a very special role to be played by the national management organizations in this process, on top of everything that governments and chambers of commerce and individual companies in their respective industries might do to build that positive and value-creating cooperation. So it's a great, and Rajiv, thank you so much for for developing this theme, as Mr. Dempo has also rightfully thanked you for. I also would like to thank all the other speakers and the moderators that we have had today, starting with Mr. Arun for the first session, which he moderated with Professor Samuel Tong from Macau, Professor Sundaram from Malaysia, and Professor Michelson from Hong Kong, which touched on a wide range of issues about the Asian imperative, ranging from technology to financial cooperation and so on. And also, I would like to thank Mr. Sharma for leading the second session with Mr. Pandey, Mr. Chinoy, and Mr. Soni, which really provided a very good sharing about how we have built, how we have survived and be resilient through the COVID crisis. And even that, all the leaders in that session recognized the tremendous value of collaboration on a wide range of areas, including climate financing and even carbon markets and so on. So thank you to all the panelists and all the moderators of the two sessions that have taken place earlier today. And also, I would like to give a very special vote of thanks to Smita, being our ever so important and essential coordinator of this entire event, and everyone who has helped her, especially from the unseen hands on the panel, on the console, who have made sure that our Zoom has performed flawlessly today. So thank you to all that have contributed to the very successful and very stable and streaming session that we had. I also thank all of you who are online listening to our Triennial Conference today for your participation, even though we cannot see you. I'm well aware that we are in the presence of not just the three of us, but several hundred executives who have taken off their time to listen to the thoughts being shared today. So I once again thank you, everybody, and particularly thank you, Mr. Dampo, for concluding our excellent afternoon with such wonderfully lucid and inspiring thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cheong, and thank you, Mr. Kaul and Mr. Dempo, for sharing your views and thoughts with us. This was an absolutely perfect conclusion to the AAMO's 21st Triennial Conference, this very special conference as it happens only once every 3 years. Ladies and gentlemen, we also thank you for participating actively in the conference, and for all our viewers who are watching our live stream on the social media channels. With this, we have come to the conclusion of today's conference, and we all wish you a good day or a good evening ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Smita.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Dev Srini.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
soon,
Rajiv, and thank you,
Mr. Chong.
Mr.
See you very soon.
See you again soon. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.